one of the most chilling true survival stories in American history. It had almost everything: hunger, freezing cold, and even cannibalism. And it all began during the era of the gold rush, when a group of families set out on what was supposed to be a simple journey west. They dreamed of a new life, but instead walked straight into a trap from which almost no one was meant to return. Before we continue, I'd appreciate your subscription. Now let's return to the story. Spring October 1846. In the mid-1840s, the American West was portrayed as a land of new beginnings. Newspapers promised fertile California soil, gold, and the chance to start life anew. That hope inspired several families, the Donners, the Reeds, and many others, to sell their homes, gather their belongings, and set out on a journey more than 2,000 miles long. In April 1846, their wagons rolled west. The first months felt promising. Open plains, warm nights, shared meals by the fire. People laughed, talked about their plans for California, and believed that their trip would be long but completely ordinary. Over time, the families bonded, becoming almost one large moving community. But by summer they heard about a new route, Lansford Hastings' so-called shortcut. He claimed it would save weeks of travel. Few realized that no major wagon train had ever taken this path before. After some hesitation, the promise of a faster route proved too tempting. And by fall 1846, the group left the main trail and followed Hastings' cutoff into deserts and untested terrain. That decision was their first major mistake. They lost nearly a month. Brutal heat, broken wagons, dying animals, arguments, exhaustion, and shrinking supplies. Yet they kept moving forward, because turning back felt impossible. By October, the Sierra Nevada finally rose before them. They knew they needed to cross just one mountain pass, and California would be within reach. They could see the route ahead, see openings between the trees, even patches of bare, snowless ground. It felt like they still had a chance. Then the weather turned. The sky darkened, a cold wind swept across the valley, and the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, the storm became a white wall that swallowed the trail. Wheels sank, animals collapsed, and people fought the wind with every step. The blizzard lasted through the night. By morning, they faced what they feared most. The pass was buried. The road no longer existed. And just like that, their dream of a new life ended in a sudden, merciless trap. The winter of 1846, November 1846. After the blizzard, any hope of maybe tomorrow we can move on disappeared quickly. In the following days, it became clear that the situation was far worse than they feared. The snow kept falling, and the pass remained buried. People tried again and again to approach the trail, but the path was swallowed under deep drifts. Each attempt cost hours and strength they no longer had. When they returned for the last time, most finally understood. This was no temporary delay. This was their new reality. Food supplies were dangerously low. What they had left after the desert and the long journey would not last. They began rationing strictly. Tiny portions split among families, thin soups made from whatever they still had. Flour was disappearing fast. Some joked they would soon have to boil leather straps, until the joke became the truth. The cold was just as deadly as hunger. Nights were so freezing that water turned solid right next to the fire, and breathing became icy mist. People woke trembling, wrapped in all the blankets they had. The makeshift cabins, thrown together in haste, let the wind in. Snow drifted through cracks in some of them. The fire could not save them. It only gave the illusion of warmth. Children suffered first. Some developed persistent coughs. Others became extremely weak, often sleeping most of the day as their bodies tried to conserve energy. Parents sat beside them, barely taking their eyes off their children. Even minor colds were dangerous here. They could quickly turn into something fatal because of hunger and the brutal cold. Tension in the camp grew. People argued over food, over firewood, over any place closer to the fire. Hastings's name was spoken with anger and blame, but it changed nothing. They weren't trapped by a person anymore. They were trapped by snow that would not melt for months. Late November, early December 1846. The days in the trap began to blur together. The snow never stopped. Blizzards swept through the camp several times a week, and the cabins, thrown together in haste, started to sag under the weight. People often woke in the darkness to find the roof pressing down on their blankets. They had to crawl out into the freezing night and shovel snow off the roofs just to keep the structures from collapsing. Every task cost them strength they no longer had. Food was nearly gone. What remained wasn't even food. Boiled leather straps, pieces of old boots, and thin broth made from bones that had long lost any flavor. Leather had to be boiled for hours before it softened enough to chew. Some people chewed pine bark. Others tried catching mice that occasionally ran inside the cabins seeking warmth. Hunger began to change people. Families that once shared everything now hid whatever scraps they had. A few small thefts took place, insignificant in normal life. But in these conditions, every crumb mattered. Suspicion grew. Arguments broke out. Trust between families slowly unraveled. The cold was no less deadly. At night, temperatures dropped so low that breath froze on men's beards. Fingers and toes went numb. Some lost feeling entirely. One man fell asleep near the fire and never woke up, found stiff and silent at dawn. No one knew whether it was hunger or the cold that took him. More deaths followed, each one quieter than the last. People's minds began to fray. The howling wind and the constant creaking of the cabins made nights feel endless. Some swore they saw shadows moving in the dark. Children began hallucinating, muttering in their sleep, asking for food that didn't exist. Parents could do nothing but hold them and pray they would make it through another night. And although no one dared to say it aloud, a fear settled over the camp like a heavy fog. If winter kept going like this, none of them would survive. They needed help from outside, but no one was coming. It was in these days of despair that an idea emerged, one that would soon shape the fate of the entire group. Send a small team over the mountains to find rescue, even if it meant walking straight into death. Mid-December 1846. Each day in the camp grew quieter. People barely spoke anymore. Their voices faded together with their strength. Most moved slowly, as if aging right before each other's eyes. Exhaustion, hunger, and cold erased every trace of emotion from their faces. Children lay wrapped in blankets, motionless. Adults sat by the fire, staring into the flames, no longer thinking, simply waiting for the next hour to pass. The dead began to remain in the cabins longer than anyone thought proper or respectful. The frost made their bodies hard as stone, and no one had the strength to carry them out into the forest and bury them under the deep snow. Some turned their heads away. Others sat silently beside the bodies, unable to accept what was happening. But the most frightening part was the silence surrounding these deaths. No one said what should happen next, and that silence felt heavier than the storm outside. One evening, as the fire sputtered and dimmed, someone whispered a sentence the others pretended not to hear. In nature, nothing goes to waste. Even death feeds life." After those words, the entire cabin fell into a suffocating stillness. People lowered their eyes. No one dared to speak, but everyone understood. Hunger was pushing them toward boundaries they never imagined they would approach. Minds began to slip. Some spoke incoherently. Others stared at a single point for hours, their thoughts empty. One man paced in circles around the cabin, muttering to himself, fighting the creeping madness. Mothers held their children tightly, as if afraid that in this darkness they might lose them in more than one way. Out of this despair came an idea that once seemed unthinkable. Send a group over the mountains to find help. Not because anyone believed salvation was likely, but because everyone agreed the camp would not survive another month, perhaps not even another week. 15 volunteers prepared for the journey. They cut blankets into makeshift snowshoes, crafted crude snow goggles, and searched for anything that could be considered food. They said their goodbyes like people preparing for death. Many knew they would never see these faces again. When the 15 stepped out of the camp and into the deep white silence, those who remained felt the weight of something darker than the cold. And an unspoken question hovered over the cabins like a winter fog. What will happen when the next person dies? And will anyone still be able to resist the thing they fear most? Late December 1846. Early January 1847. When the 15 volunteers disappeared beyond the White Hills, the camp fell into a silence so deep it felt as if life had left with them. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the cold pressed closer with every gust of wind. Snow blocked every passage, leaving only narrow paths between the cabins. Firewood was running out, and the flames that remained flickered weakly, unable to warm even the closest hands. Hunger was no longer a feeling. It had become a living enemy. People woke with stabbing pain in their stomachs, with cramps so strong they could barely move. Their bodies had begun consuming themselves from within. They had already eaten every scrap of leather, pine bark, bone broth, and the dogs. The last hope of real nourishment disappeared long ago. And then the moment came, the moment everyone knew was approaching. One morning, a young woman from the Murphy family died. She had grown too weak, too thin, too cold to continue. She simply never woke up. Her body lay in the cabin for hours. No one spoke, but the truth was reflected in every glance. What happens now? The family sat around her, motionless. The frost outside had turned the ground into solid stone. To bury her, someone would need to shovel through layers of frozen snow and ice, an impossible task for people who could barely stand. Then quietly, almost inaudibly, one of the women whispered, "If we don't do this, we will all die." No one answered, but silence was enough. That evening, they crossed a boundary they once believed no human should ever cross. They did not act out of madness or cruelty. They acted the way people do when the world leaves them no choices. Slowly, silently, with tears, with shame, with prayer. Some turned their faces away. Some could not look at all. But every person there knew the truth. Without this, the camp would not survive the next few days. The news spread through the other cabins without a single spoken word. People avoided naming what had happened. They said phrases like, "We had no choice," or "God will forgive us," or simply said nothing at all. Emotionally, it broke many of them. Some withdrew into themselves. Others avoided eye contact. But beneath all the anguish, there was a grim, undeniable reality. Those few pieces of flesh gave them just enough strength to endure another day. And in the Sierra Nevada that winter, a single day of life was a victory. Death had become not just a tragedy, but the only currency left. And as the freezing nights returned again and again, the people in the camp already understood this would not be the last time. January 1847. When the group of 15 disappeared beyond the white drifts, no one knew what awaited them in the mountains. They moved slowly, waist-deep in snow, wrapped in blankets that became soaked within minutes. The glare of the snow blinded their eyes, the cold bit into their fingers, and every breath burned their lungs. They walked as if through a white wall, hoping that somewhere beyond it lay something other than cold. Their food consisted of a few scraps of dried leather, some flour, and whatever crumbs were left from the camp. By the second day, they realized it wasn't enough even for a week. People began collapsing from exhaustion. One man fainted in a snowbank and never rose again. The others carried him for hours before accepting the truth. He died that same evening. The next day, another woman died. The cold claimed her without warning. The group stood around her silently, trying to think through the fog of hunger, but thought itself was becoming difficult. They were turning into shadows of themselves, and then they did what once would have been unthinkable. Someone said quietly, "We can't leave her like this. We still have to keep moving." Again, silence. But silence meant agreement. This was the beginning of what history would later call the Forlorn Hope, the March of the Doomed. Every few days, another person fell. They kept moving, taking with them only what might buy them one more night of life. Frostbite, hunger, collapsed bodies, hallucinations. At times, they saw lights that vanished into reflections on the snow. Some had to be left behind. Meanwhile, the tragedy inside the camp only deepened. Snowdrifts grew higher, firewood nearly ran out, and the cabins sagged under the weight. Hunger once again drove people to the brink. When another person died, no one asked, "What do we do now?" They already knew. The choice had become part of daily survival, as ordinary as keeping the fire alive. Children barely rose from their beds. Adults spoke rarely. People feared the nights most, feared every cough, every groan of weakness. Feared the moment when another body would grow still, and they would once again face a decision that tore at the soul. In the mountains, those seeking rescue were dying step by step. In the camp, those waiting were dying day by day, and no one knew which would vanish first, the people or the hope itself. February 1847. When the surviving members of the Forlorn Hope, barely alive and on the edge of madness, reached the first settlements, word spread quickly. Dozens of people were trapped in the Sierra Nevada without food, freezing, and dying. Local farmers and volunteers formed a small rescue team. 3 men set out into the mountains, not by order, not for reward, but because they could not accept leaving people to die alone. The road to the camp was brutal. Deep snow, freezing winds that cut through clothing, and faint, half-erased footprints of those who had wandered there before. The rescuers pushed on, knowing that the lives of entire families depended on them. As they approached Truckee Lake, the first thing they noticed was the silence. A complete, unnatural silence. No voices, no movement, no sounds of a living camp. Just the wind whispering through the trees, as if warning them that what they were about to see could no longer be undone. The first cabin had a collapsed roof. 2 children sat outside, wrapped in blankets, so thin they looked as though a strong wind might blow them away. They stared at the rescuers with wide eyes filled with fear and a fragile hope. Inside the cabin, the men found scenes they were not prepared for, even in their worst nightmares. People lay on the floor, unmoving. Some were alive but barely breathing. Others had died long before, and their bodies had become part of the cabin's grim landscape. On a small table lay a knife and bones stripped clean, and the rescuers understood immediately before anyone spoke a word. It wasn't a choice. It was desperation. One of the children, a girl about 10 years old, whispered the first words the rescuers heard in that camp. "Do you have something for us to eat?" Only after saying it did she begin to cry. She hadn't shed tears in weeks. Her body was too weak to make them. The rescuers gave food to those who were strong enough to eat, but even that had to be done carefully. After such starvation, eating too quickly could kill them. They left part of their supplies in the camp and began taking out the first survivors, the weakest children. But for some, the rescue came too late. Their bodies were too damaged, their organs too far gone. A few people died moments after seeing help arrive. The shock was overwhelming, not only for the rescuers, but for all of California. No one believed such a tragedy could be real. No one imagined people could suffer this much on their way to a better life. But it was real, and the truth was only beginning to emerge from beneath the snow. March, April 1847. After the first rescue team arrived, 2 more followed. Each of them found survivors in a condition words could barely describe. Some could not stand. Others collapsed unconscious in the snow. A few no longer understood where they were or who was speaking to them. Many families were evacuated in stages, the children first, then those who could still walk, and finally the ones who were moments from death. What the rescuers saw in the camp was no longer survival. It was the final flicker of life. Some people sat silently, staring into emptiness. Others were afraid to step outside their cabins even when they were told that help had arrived. A few still clung to the hands of loved ones who had died days earlier, unable to accept the loss. The forlorn hope survivors, the group of 15 who dared to cross the mountains, had paid a terrible price as well. Only 7 of them lived. Their faces were so gaunt and hollow that people struggled to believe these were living humans. They told stories of collapse, of companions dying on the trail, of some begging to be left behind because they could walk no farther. And yet, none of them called themselves heroes. They all repeated the same words. "We just wanted to reach help. There was no other choice." When the last group of survivors was finally led out of the mountains in April 1847, the snow began to melt. The landscapes that had been towering white walls all winter now revealed black earth, snapped branches, and the remains of makeshift shelters. It was as if nature itself was trying to cover what had happened there. Out of the 87 people who set out hoping to start a new life in California, only 48 survived. Nearly half perished, and what the survivors endured shocked the entire nation. Newspapers wrote about the horrors above the clouds, about men, women, and children who fought for life in conditions no human should ever face. People struggled to believe such tragedy could occur. Not in a distant land, not in stories of the past, but within America itself. Just a few hundred miles from civilization. This story became a scar on the map of the country, a scar that reminds us, sometimes the so-called American dream demanded a price no one should ever have to pay.